Okay, so we're on to the sixth session in the Organisational Reliability and Resilience module, which is about commitment and improvisation, which is about containing risk. So we've gone through a series of stages in really understanding risk up to this point, and here we are at trying to understand what we can do in the face of risk, in the face of it emerging. How can we contain that problem? What can people within the organisation do to contain that problem? Okay, this is one of Elmar's models. Again, it's I guess trying to illustrate the organisation tackling risk when it appears, pushing it away. The question marks of the risk are the emerging, happening, being realised, and the organisation pushing it away whilst maintaining resilience in the face of other potential risks. So the key issues which we're going to talk about in this session are how can organisations develop a commitment to contain risk and uncertainty? So how can they develop this commitment? How can organisations provide support to counter problems? So what can organisations do to provide the support that people in the organisation at the point of tackling the uncertainty, tackling the risk, tackling the problem or crisis they're facing need, and resolving the contradiction between collective ownership and the responsibility of the individual to act. I'll talk quite a bit about that in the middle of this session. Okay, as always in these sessions, I start with the lure, in this case the lure of control. So in our book we talked about, I effectively have quoted this little passage from the book. Not only is the organisation and its members prepared for the expected risk, but also for the unexpected, uncertainty. Okay, so we're not only prepared in the organisation, we're starting this session with the assumption that the organisation is prepared, has done what I've talked about previously, is prepared for the expected risk and also for the unexpected uncertainty. So what does that mean? That means there is a state of alertness with participants constantly on the lookout for what might go wrong. Okay, yet, as with all actions, there are behavioural obstacles that make this state of readiness less effective. And that's what we're going to look at in this session. Okay, we'll start with impediments to containment. So as with the previous sessions, and the same will apply to this session and the next one, I'm going to structure those sessions in exactly the same way. Start with the impediments, things stopping containment in this case, then the enablers, things which will enable containment, then talk about issues around that enablement, and then finally think about containment across organisations briefly. Okay, so I've got a number of factors here listed which we pick up in our book. I'll talk in a little bit of detail about some of these. I'll mention habitual responses, talk about hierarchical escalation, accountability, isolation and non-commitment. So let's start with habitual responses. So essentially this is the antithesis of mindfulness, and means that people just won't respond to threats when they encounter them. It's very related to threat rigidity, which I talked about in the last session, where organisations just revert to what's worked well in the past. When faced with some threats, trained habitual responses are useful and routines are vital, as I talked about last time. But in the face of unforeseen threats, habitual responses are what Plotnik and Turov called maladaptive. Okay, maladaptive in the sense that they aren't really tackling the problem. In fact, in some cases, they can make the problem worse. They can create more problems than they solve. So responses are processes, as I said, talked about last time. Routines are important and useful, and trained responses are important. So training and trained responses are vital to most organisations. And in the face of some threats, that's great. However, if it's just habitual, if you just do it without thinking, then you'll end up in a situation where you're actually making the problem worse. Well, that's what Plotnik and Turov argue. And the reference is down there in the left-hand corner. Okay, so let's think a bit about hierarchy in organisations. And this actually focuses around the notion of communication. So on the left-hand side, organisation A has a steep hierarchy. It has slow decision making. The message gets distorted as it goes up and down the hierarchy and changes, and information is manipulated for the purposes of the individuals conveying that information. In the organisation B, it's a flatter hierarchy. Communication up and down is very fast. Seems to be a great solution, and in fact, flatter organisational hierarchies are what a lot of organisations aim for. They try to strip out middle management, which isn't really adding much value and is making communication slow. The problem with that is that we end up with having a great deal of sideways communication, and that can be slow or even non-existent. Okay, so organisation structure B is not necessarily perfect. It's better than I would guess than organisation structure A, which has got too many layers of hierarchy. Now, why is this a problem? Why is this steep hierarchy a problem? It's because of escalation. In the face of crisis, what do organisations do? As we saw last time, they seek to pass the message about the problem up the organisation to pass on accountability. So rather than make decisions at the point of the crisis, they pass the message up and wait for somebody in a senior position to make a decision. They do that for good reasons. They don't want to be sacked. They don't want to lose a job. They don't want to. Maybe this is procedure and what's required of managers and junior managers and people at the operational point of activity. Maybe this is what they're required to do. This beyond maybe their pay grade to do this, make a decision at that level, and rather wait for messages to come down from senior management. With steep hierarchies in organisations, senior management are remote and removed from the situation and have less understanding. So I've got a reference there to, for example, General Alphonse Joseph Georget, who was picked up in the Fall of France case, which I looked at the end of this session, beginning of next session. So there are big dangers in this reporting and escalation culture, but it's very, very commonplace in organisations. I need somebody senior to me to make the decision for me. That person needs someone senior to them. You end up with excessive reporting. And the big problem with this is, together with message distortion, insufficient information being passed up and down the hierarchy, distance and remoteness, there's also a slow response. So in the meantime, the crisis, the problem is just getting worse and worse and worse. The costs associated with that are becoming more and more substantial and is not getting solved. And this is all around the issue of accountability. Is it my fault? Is it your fault? Whose fault is it? And so organisations are brilliant at trying to identify someone to blame, a scapegoat, if you will. Someone to blame, someone who they can cast as a scapegoat to absolve their own personal issues with problems occurring within the organisation, when actually they're systematic problems, as we've seen earlier in previous sessions. So, what's this issue around accountability? Well, some of the issues are escalation tends to be the consequence of accountability. So what we talked about just now, escalation is a consequence of accountability and compliance and a lack of empowerment. There's no empowerment at the operational level, at the point of contact. There's a compliance culture. You comply. If you haven't complied, you can be blamed. People seem to cover themselves. They protect themselves. And compliance, if I've done what I've got to do, my job says I've got to do this, then I'm okay. The fact that the organisation may be encountering disaster is in some ways irrelevant to the fact that people are covering themselves. Quite understandably, it's human behaviour. And it goes to, as I said, the next point, the heart of organisational governance, which is a blame and castigate culture. Whose fault is it? Who can we scapegoat? Who can we cast aside? Okay, and so accountability shifts, moves. Everyone tries to avoid accountability. I'll talk about some of the possible solutions to this in the next section of this session. People also become isolated. There's a failure to appreciate complexity. We talked about this when I talked about understanding organisations as complex systems. So people fail to appreciate the complexity of organisations. They have organisational myopia, which I've talked about previously, and they have a failure to appreciate tight coupling. The fact that one part of the organisation has a lot of dependencies, both up and down its supply chain within the organisation, and that organisations themselves have broader dependencies on other organisations and other people. So this tight coupling is really not appreciated. People within the organisation fail to see the big picture. Part of the driver for this, I argue, is this rather slightly provocative statement that risk is a fiction. I think certainly in my research, which I've carried out with my colleague Elmar, it seems that people within organisations don't really treat risk as real until it emerges, until it happens. So it's this thing which may or may not happen. And so it is just a fiction. It's just a concept, something abstract, which people can't really grasp. It's something that may happen, but we don't really think about it and don't want to think about it within organisations because it hasn't happened and may never happen. So risk, this view that risk is a fiction, it's actually really, really commonplace in organisations. People don't want to talk about dealing with something or thinking about something or concerning themselves with something which may never happen. Of course, it's a fiction until it materialises, until it actually becomes real, until the risk announces itself and becomes a real thing which is happening to the organisation. And something we talked about in a paper we published just a few years ago was this lure of non-commitment. It's the behaviour of people within organisations to not really commit too much to something which actually may be just a fiction. So I encourage you to take a look at that paper. It's quite short and hopefully quite readable. I think I put it on Canvas, and it talks about these series of lures of people in the face of risk, and one of the key ones we identified was lure of non-commitment, not really committing. And of course this session is about commitment. It's about people committing to dealing with risk and uncertainty as and when it appears. But if you aren't committed to it because you don't really believe in risk, because it's too abstract for you, then nothing will happen. Okay, so we talked about one or two of the issues which are stopping organisations containing. So how can we enable containment? I'll pick up on a few of these. I'll talk about commitment, abundant expertise, which I've called deep knowledge, and I mention, and then I'll talk at some length about improvisation. So let's start with this idea of a commitment to resilience. Really, it's one of the key aspects of Carwike's model of high reliability organisations. It's about putting in place smooth, well-planned procedures which are crucial in the first instance when things start to become problematic. Think about threat rigidity. In the face of most threats, smooth, well-planned procedures are fine, and organisations will get through those threats and contain them and deal with them and can move on. And most threats organisations face are really not that major. However, lots of organisations do at some point face major problems, and that's when a shift to plan B is so crucial. It requires good competencies, which I've called deep knowledge, and quick feedback. So I'll pick up on deep knowledge. What do you mean by that? Deep knowledge. It's another concept which is it can be found in the literature. It's about expertise not being the same necessarily as an. So expertise is distinct from experts. Expertise is about proficiency, skill, specialist knowledge, which is situational. It's situated. It's dynamic. It changes and it's relational. Okay, it's about the relationships between people. Experts might be someone who's very knowledgeable in a particular area, and they're experts everywhere in all sorts of organisations. Expertise is unlikely to be defined by hierarchy, status, or ego, nor is it necessarily something which you can get a certificate in that's not necessarily accredited. It's about deep factual knowledge in a particular field and a way of appreciating that it is dynamic. There's rarely only one best way of doing things in a complex situation, and solutions and choices are likely to evolve over time. The expert's opinion is not to be mistaken for the end of the discussion about an answer. Instead, expertise is the beginning of a discourse, triggering a process of fact-finding, knowledge generation, and problem solving. Okay? Right. So one of the big things that I think is important to organisations is improvisation. In the lecture, when I was teaching this, I talked about jazz as the metaphor, and this is often used as a metaphor for organisations around improvisation. White's talked a lot about improvisation, and in fact, this is reference from a paper by Carl Weick. But it's not just Weick. Other people have talked about improvisation within organisations. Organisational improvisation is an important aspect. It's about being able to have structure and some sort of process, but then being able to act around that structure, act around that process. So some of the points here: willingness to forego planning and act in real time. So don't just stick to the plan, but deal with emerging changes and the emerging situation. Understanding of internal resources. What can we bring to deal with this problem? Proficiency without blueprints, so we don't have to have a process for everything. The ability to agree with minimal structures. So we're not always deferring to somebody in a more senior position. Openness to departure from routines. So we have routines, they're important as I've discussed, but organisations which want to be resilient need to be able to depart from those routines, to do something different and go with that different option. Using themes, fragments and phrases to guide ongoing action. So in other words, we don't have a clear entire picture, we don't have a clear full understanding of the situation, but we use what we have in order to help us work our way through problems. Going up to the right-hand column there, recognising partial relevance of previous experience. Previous experience is important and helps inform what we do now, but is only partially relevant. New situations, new problems need, yes, partly some previous experience, but also acting in the here and now and not relying entirely on previous experience. The availability of high confidence in the skills of others. So this is about redundancy, really. It's having lots of skills which aren't necessarily all employed at the same time, all the time, but are available should a problem arise. The ability to observe and respond to the performance of others at their pace. A focus of coordination and a preference for and comfort with process rather than structure. Okay. So, some of the issues around improvisation. It's a real paradox which organisations find difficult to enact. So the paradox is between planning control on the one hand and improvisation on the other hand. How can these both be happening within the organisation at the same time? Planning control is important. Really, it's about not having too much planning, not too much control. Having the planning control there, but knowing when to deviate from the plans, relax control. It's about developing capabilities around improvisation, so people are able to improvise and feel free to improvise. It's providing freedom and space to improvise repertoires and responses, and it's about freedom to think and reflect, so giving people time to think, time to reflect. Again, this is all about redundancy, really. These are all redundant resources which are available should the organisation need to draw on them. Okay, so I'm not going to drop improvisation, I'm going to pick it up again, but just tackle some of the issues which are about enabling containment. And here I'm going to pick up on facilitating improvisation, organisational culture and just culture in particular. So I'm going to focus a bit on culture as a way of dealing with the accountability problem. Okay, so facilitating improvisation. What we can start with are rewards for readiness, rewards for being prepared. BBBs, behaviour-based expectations. So some of the things that we've talked about in our research in terms of allowing improvisation to occur are what we broadly categorise as provocative competence. And what we mean by that are the affirmative move, where the manager has an excellent knowledge of the team's capabilities, often understanding individual team members' strengths better than they do themselves. So it's being able to management understanding who's in the organisation, who can do what, who's available, who can be drawn upon. Having small disruptions to routines. So introductions of small disruptions to routines, such as shifting a regular meeting to a different occasional time or switching personnel around. This now enables people to be prepared for breaking out of routine and doing something differently, and gives them an alertness to having to improvise a little bit. Providing problems to solve. So giving the team or a group of people a problem or a number of problems to solve and tackling them in a safe environment. So it's a bit like the training stuff I was talking about in an earlier session. Then we have something we call incremental reorientation. That's facilitating by encouraging repetition. This involves learning new routines or ways of doing things based on the problems they have solved. So you've got solving problems. What does this lead to in terms of new routines? Okay, and finally what we've called analogic sharpening. That's the provocative competence intervention should have allowed the team to work out new links and connections which they can employ in problem solving. This might be new or better understanding of other skills or new knowledge about resources that they could draw upon when faced with a crisis. Okay, so there's a whole load of things there which we think that organisations could put into place in order to have teams and groups of people within the organisation in a position where they can then leap into improvisation should that be necessary. Okay, culture. So I moved on to culture, and the reason I moved on to culture was because culture is fundamental to the way organisations go about doing things. And one of the problems around accountability and about higher escalation up and down the hierarchy is that it's cultural, that people will be blamed and castigated. That's culture. Okay, so this model is a kind of classic model of culture. You have it's often shown as a onion diagram, but I've just shown it as an up and down diagram here. And in the centre, so it's the Zeka-Shines model. In the centre, you have basic assumptions of how things are in how we regard reality, time, space, human activity, human relationships. Around that, you have values, and at the outside of the culture, the things we can see are the artifacts and creations we produce, which are based on our basic assumptions and values. Okay, and so this is the visible and audible behaviour that happens, patterns, technology, art, those sort of things. Okay, these are the outside, and from these we can only infer what the fundamental values and basic assumptions of people are within the organisation. But this applies right across organisations. Some organisations have one particular culture, other organisations have a different culture. Ellen Valich said organisational culture is like pornography. It's harder to find, but you know it when you see it. It's a nice quote. Now, why is this important? Well, what organisations are starting to seek to do, some organisations which are working in very particularly uncertain environments, is to introduce something called just culture. So just culture is a kind of process, really, has a series of categorisations. Things go wrong, and what happens when those things go wrong? People do something wrong, something happens. When people are allowed latitude and empowered to do things, something goes wrong. It's about understanding mistakes and problems through system thinking. Okay, so we have human error. This might be an inadvertent slip, a lapse or mistake. What's the response? Consult the individual. It's not their fault. It's about creating a failure-proof system that won't allow that breach or inadvertent slip to happen again. Then we have at-risk behaviour, a conscious drift from resilient behaviour when the individual believes the drift doesn't cause harm. This is kind of practical drift I'm talking about here. Okay, people drift into behaviours which are risky in and of themselves or allow risk to occur. In this case, coach the individual, assess a system for weaknesses that encourage or require individuals to take risks and improve or failure-proof the system. And then we have reckless behaviour, choosing to engage in behaviour that is unjustified or leads to substantial risk. In this case, those individuals need to be disciplined. Okay, this kind of behaviour is not acceptable in any organisation. So people make mistakes, inadvertent slips, or end up in at-risk behaviour. Both these situations are ones which aren't necessarily about individual problems, but about systems that allow those behaviours to occur. Reckless behaviour, on the other hand, is something that is highly problematic and unacceptable. And that's the sort of behaviour which has to be castigated, not minor inadvertent slips, lapses or mistakes, not even at-risk behaviour which occurs probably through some sort of system problem. Okay, there's some at-risk behaviour I talked about in the lecture. What's wrong with this picture? The guy isn't wearing a seatbelt. We've become in society, most societies, wearing seatbelts is just a natural thing to do. We encourage our children to do it from an early age, and we do it ourselves, and it's become normal. So that's some at-risk behaviour. Okay, so how do we develop a just culture? Focus on the system rather than pointing the finger of blame. Okay, all failures, weaknesses, near misses have to be identified. So, but the only way you're going to get people to identify or to own up or to announce weaknesses, near misses, is if the blame culture is shifted to one of a just culture. Okay. Otherwise, people hide the problems. So there's a tension between accountability and support. It's a real problem for organisations to shift to one of support and systems thinking rather than one of a blame culture and accountability. And it requires development and reward through behaviour-based expectations. The aim is to develop and embed new norms within the culture of the organisation. That it's okay to report, to whistleblow, to point out problems, in fact, that kind of behaviour is rewarded rather than marginalised or castigated. I talked earlier about big picture thinking. Here's the development of our model. So we have the problem, risk or uncertainty or complexity. This leads to a response. And then we have the impact of response. It's understanding the impact of that response, which is crucial to understanding the nature of the problem that organisations face. Okay, so finally I'm going to talk a little bit about commitment across organisations. So the one bit I'm going to really focus on here is partnering. So you'll only get commitment if you partner with organisations. So this is about a commitment to contain risk requires input from suppliers. The risk could start with suppliers and then work its way through the supply chain. It could be something we pass on to our customers, or it could be something that customers create, which we then have to tackle. Okay, so risk requires input for suppliers and customers. Actually, I haven't put that there, but and customers. Traditional arm's length contracts aren't really sufficient for dealing with this. You won't get the commitment to contain risk, the ability to improvise, the just culture, all those sort of things through an arm's length contract. Partnering, for some organisations, is the way to deal with this. It's blurring the organisational boundaries and organisational identity. The question is, should an organisation partner with all its suppliers and all its customers? That's a good question, I think. This useful model by Krylich is commonly used in supply chain management and operations management. I use it myself when I'm teaching those subjects. But for our point of view, what it does is it allows you to think about those sort of organisations which you might partner with, and those sort of organisations which you can keep an arm's length position. So it's around risk on one axis, whether it's high, the technical or supply risk, whether it's high or low for our organisation, and the impact on our business should something go wrong. What's the value or cost of that impact? Is it high or low? Okay, and those where the risk is high and the impact on the business is high are the organisations we cooperate with, we partner with, we create long-term relationships with. These are the ones who want to get on board with our organisation and work in the same way as our organisation to get that commitment to resilience through the supply chain. Other organisations where risk of supply is low and the impact on the business will be low, those ones we just concentrate on efficiency, don't worry too much about them, and they are less prominent in our thinking around resilience. Now, what's useful here is to employ the often called 80-20 rule, or the Pareto principle, which is that 80% of the value is in 20% of the productive activity. And that's a kind of rule of thumb, but actually it's borne out in lots of situations. So, and I think it's borne out here as well, that 20% of the suppliers will probably provide roughly 80% of the value of the organisation. And so it's those 20% we want to be thinking about whether we need to partner with them, and the other 80% probably are far less important. Okay, so in the session I talked about the case of the fall of France. I'm not going to go into it now. We did that in the teaching. It's a nice case around picking up lots of factors we talked about up to now in the course. So some takeaway points. Where risk and uncertainty emerge, it needs to be contained. Okay, that's the starting point. So despite all our best efforts, risk and uncertainty will happen. And resilience is about understanding that's the case and then being in a position to contain it. The biggest problem stopping people doing that is, I think, shifting accountability, a blame culture, and habitual responses to problems. Okay? And the key means of tackling emerging problems is improvisation. But you need a just culture and a relaxing of a blame culture and shifting to a just culture to allow that to happen. Okay, thank you.